Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we'll kick off if that's okay. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm Shashank Joshi. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute, where I'm interested in South Asia and the Middle East. It's my great pleasure to welcome Gideon Rachman today, who's here to launch his fantastic new book, Easternisation, War and Peace of the Asian Century. I've got a copy here, so please get your phones out, rush onto Amazon to buy it this second. But as you do so, please also turn your phones onto silent so we can have an undisturbed conversation. For those of you who are foolish enough not to read Gideon's weekly column, I should say he's a chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times and has been for 10 years. He's reported from Brussels, Bangkok, and Washington, amongst other places, I think.
Those were the ones I lived in for a while. Yeah.
Right, and I think that those vantage points show in this book, which really spans an enormous arc right across from Europe to the Middle East to Asia. There's loads I'd like to talk about. Even events since the book has come out, I think, have been particularly interesting. We have had a leader of the Philippines use the most foul-mouthed language imaginable against his ally, the US president. I won't repeat it in this esteemed institution, but it was pretty foul. We have had an incredible realignment take place, or seem to take place, between Philippines, the US, and China. Inklings of realignment with other Southeast Asian states and China. Developments we may have missed, like Australia and Indonesia talking about joint patrols in the South China Sea. And of course, bigger developments like the apparent setbacks to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And of course, as Gideon told me just before we started, Trump has edged ahead in the ABC polls. And so that obviously has severe consequences, not just for Europe and our alliance system, the Atlantic Alliance, but also all of those Asian states whose security is bound up with a continued US presence. And that US presence, I think, is a major theme of this book. So before we get into some of those detailed aspects, I thought we'd kick off just by asking, what is Easternisation? And is it just another word for the rise of China? Or is it something else?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, China is absolutely central to the book, and it's central to the process that I describe as Easternisation. But I quite consciously tried to argue that it's the most important part of a broader phenomenon, which is the shift of economic power from west to east, which has now reached a kind of critical stage where I think it's now beginning to change global politics as well. So you mentioned that I lived in Bangkok, and that was in the early 90s, and I was the Economist correspondent. And at that point, that job was really mainly an economics and business job. Southeast Asia had developed fast, South Korea, obviously Japan in the 60s. But these were relatively small countries growing at 7, 8, 9%. When China begins to do that from 79 onwards, and then India from a little, the early 90s with the reforms of Manmohan Singh, then you have two huge countries which are, by now, have reached a sort of critical mass that, according to the IMF, they ranked the world's largest economies in 2014 by purchasing power. And at that point, they said, well, China is actually now the world's largest economy. Now, in the press, habitually, people say the US. That's at real exchange rates. But in purchasing power terms, China is. And in fact, the top 4 economies, according to the IMF, it was China, then the US, then Japan, then India. In other words, 3 of the 4 were in Asia. And that is now reflected in a shift in global political power. And that's really what I then examined. So in the first bit of the book, I just established what's happened economically. And for the rest, I try to look at, well, how is that changing the way that the world works? And in particular, I make the claim that we're really coming to the end, or the beginning of the end, of 500 years of Western dominance of the world, which begins with the imperial age in the late 1400s, and Vasco da Gama and Columbus and so on. And from then on, Europe, and then more recently the United States, have been the dominant powers in the world. And even when you had the Cold War, Russia was a European power, and the center ground of the Cold War was Europe. But that's changing now.
On China specifically, how confident are you that these trends are sustainable? We've seen a slowdown in Chinese growth. We have seen even the Chinese more openly recognize the fragilities in their economic system. Even politically, we've seen, I think, more open discussion about problems within China's political apparatus, concerns about Xi Jinping's unprecedented, for the last 30, 40 years, consolidation of power, his centralization, the impact of his anti-corruption drive. With India is now the biggest, fastest growing major economy in the world. Its flaws are well known, but they're more visible and open. With China, how persuaded are you that this is sustainable and we won't see serious cracks open up and undermine the premise here?
Well, I think we probably will see serious cracks open up, but I would say it wouldn't undermine the premise. And the reason I would say that is that clearly China has enormous political and economic challenges, and it would be naive to think that they're just going to sail onwards without any crisis hitting them at some point. However, I think that they have now reached a stage where they are so powerful economically and indeed in military diplomatic terms that any crisis short of one that actually broke the country up, and that is a possibility, but I think an outside possibility, would not deflect from this idea that China is going to be an increasingly important player in the world. And to give you an analogy, in the 19th century sees the US rise to the point where eventually it becomes the greatest power in the world. Well, it goes through a civil war in the 1860s, but that doesn't actually stop the rise of the United States. I don't think China will have a civil war. I do think they will have political and economic turbulence. But that actually, oddly, could make them even more of a player internationally, because one of the themes I explore in the book, and a lot of people have discussed, is the extent to which Chinese nationalism is used as an attempted antidote to domestic instability. And you see after Tiananmen Square in '89 a deliberate rewriting of school and university curriculums to emphasize the Communist Party's role as the savior of the nation. And the more that they feel internally threatened, the more they're likely to ramp that up.
Yes, yeah. So there's a chapter, I think the second or third chapter is called The Battle for Southeast Asia. And it's about that increased economic clout making itself felt in the ASEAN area with countries like the Philippines and Thailand and so on. Yeah. And for a while in the past year, it looked as though there was a key turning point in that battle, which was the ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration on the Chinese South China Sea claims brought by the Philippines. And it looked as though China's rhetoric, its claims, had taken a serious knock in the international community. Many large world powers spoke out in favor of the Philippines at that time. And then, obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have seen this, what could be a very significant shift in the way one Southeast Asian state, the Philippines, has decided to make this big, overt gesture towards accommodation with China in language that is almost comical, in how explicit it is about the motivations. I think Duterte has said, "You, me, and Russia, it's us three against the world," or some such.
He also said there's a new power in Asia. American dominance is over. China is the resident power now, which is kind of poison in Washington, because that's exactly the idea they're trying to push back against.
So how is that battle effectively lost? Are we going to see China peel away state after state, bit by bit, Malaysia to push Singapore away, Thailand buying Chinese submarines last year with US-Thai pressure over the coup? Is that lost?
Well, I wouldn't say it's lost, but I think it's certainly not looking good at this precise moment. So I think it's a plausible scenario, possibly even the most plausible scenario, that you do see a continued Southeast Asian drift towards China, but I don't think it's inevitable. Nothing's inevitable. But I do think the Philippines is particularly serious because it was the claimant state in the legal case that you mentioned. So if they say, well, we don't care anymore, well, what does America do? Because America has been very keen to present its pushback against China as not some sort of superpower arm wrestling match, but instead America as enforcing international law and international norms on behalf of the world. Now, if it looks much more like an arm wrestling match if the Philippines are no longer interested in the legal case. Also, they're very important for the military bases because China's done this island building.
Yes.
The US had signed 5 base agreements with the Philippines under the previous President Aquino, one of which was actually quite close to some of these places was going to be an Air Force base. That looks like it probably won't happen now. And so that's important. And then there's the bandwagon effect as well.
Sure.
You mentioned Thailand. There is a problem for the US. I think you can act that to the extent that they condemn anti-democratic moves, such as the coup in Thailand in 2014, that you have a possibility that you push people into the arms of countries that, or a country that doesn't care about that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Viz. China.
Yep.
And then you're seeing it with Malaysia as well, where Razak, for a while, it looked like it might actually his domestic political problems might poison Malaysian-Chinese relations because he played the Malay card for a while, and there's a big resident Chinese population in Malaysia. The Chinese ambassador spoke out on behalf of the Chinese population, so that looked a bit tricky. But now, I think, as he's pursued through the Western courts and by the US, by the Swiss, by everyone, he feels embattled by the West, so he too has turned to China. The Chinese have bought a stake in this 1MDB, and they've also, I think he too has signed or I don't know whether it's signed, but is talking about buying submarines from China.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I suppose we see a similar dynamic in the Middle East, where US condemnation of the human rights record of countries like Egypt has also contributed to their leaders flirting with Russia, countries who are less eager to criticize their human rights record, more willing to sell arms with fewer strings attached. And even in the Philippines case, it was also partly US criticism of Duterte's drug policy that may have nudged him in that more recalcitrant direction. So are we, in a way, will we be pushed into a more Cold War direction of seeking to preserve these alliances whilst turning more of a blind eye to the domestic politics of these states, lest the Chinese jump in? I mean, certainly, India's faced this dilemma in the Indian Ocean, where, does it criticize the Sri Lankan government for its war against the Tamil Tigers, as its Tamil constituency in India wants, or does it stay shut?
Sure.
Because otherwise they'll just buy Chinese weapons. And are we being pushed into that
dilemma?
Well,
that dilemma is very live, certainly. But obviously it depends hugely on who wins the presidential election. I mean, I think Clinton and Trump would adopt very different attitudes. I think Clinton would attempt in this traditional American way to keep a balance, to try to keep human rights alive as an issue, because I think the current American administration feel that over the long run, that is important to them. And sometimes it plays well for them, so that a country that moved the other way was Burma. Which was very close to the Chinese when the generals were in charge. Then when it democratizes or starts moving towards democracy, cools on China. And if you think, as we used to think until quite recently, that the wave of the future is democracy, then you probably don't want to sort of, compromise your principles too much on human rights, but you may have to every now and then, if there's a particularly acute dilemma. But if it's Trump, I wouldn't imagine that human rights would be very high up his agenda. And I think he would probably, on the other hand, I don't think he may also not be interested in trying to maintain American dominance in the Pacific. Well, I think he will probably cut a deal, give China a sphere of influence and try to take them on economically, or maybe do it as a sort of package deal where you have some sort of realignment of both the economic and the strategic relationship. That's assuming he's capable of coherent thought.
But of course, there's also that aspect to his thought, which is talking up the prospect of a trade war, talking up the prospect of China cheating on its currency, undermining the United States. So, as you say, you never quite know which way he'll go. I mean, in terms of the effect of the Trump presidency on allies' expectations of the American role, I suppose there's two ways to go. One is you could see bandwagoning with China, as with the Philippines or other countries making their peace, accommodating, respecting sphere of influence. The other option, of course, is also the region's powers taking the task on themselves, taking on a bigger burden for security.
Which Trump has suggested, if you remember.
Yeah, in crudely speaking, of course, his point about free riding, his point about allies not paying their way, is intended to push these countries into doing more. I wonder, are we seeing the incentive for that isn't just the Americans being absent, it's also countries that want to keep their own freedom of maneuver, their own autonomy, don't want to be bound up into the American alliance system. A country like India, for example, which is moving closer to the US, but doesn't want to join US-led anti-piracy patrols, has ruled out joint patrols in the South China Sea, does not use the word alliance because the concept of an alliance is absolutely anathema in Indian strategic thought. And I was really interested to see the Indonesians and the Australians talking about South China Sea patrols. So is it realistic that more of these Asian powers will be doing more in Asia on the security front themselves?
Look, I think in the long run, whether it's Trump or Clinton, that's probably going to be the case. Because, I mean, actually when Trump lambasts the Japanese and the Koreans and the Europeans for not doing enough for their own defense, it's a sort of exaggerated cartoon version of what the Americans have been saying for a long time. You know, if you look at Gates's speech at NATO, where he said this isn't sustainable.
In 2010, yeah.
On the other hand, I think that Trump's gone a bit further, because the problem for the Americans pre-Trump was that if the Europeans or the Japanese or whoever would say, well, does that mean if we don't do more, you're not going to defend us? They would have to say, well, no, you know, NATO commitments are sacrosanct, etc. Whereas Trump has actually said, well, no, I may not defend you.
And there's a line in the book, I think, where you quote John Kerry asking his advisors, how do I stop Japan starting a war in Asia? I think that's a direct quote.
Yeah.
And of course, the flip side for even this administration and previous administrations is, how do you offer those assurances whilst
without being trapped, without
writing blank checks, without being trapped by allies, encouraging them to do more, but then sometimes finding yourself unpleasantly surprised when they do more. In the Gulf, we see this, where the US, Obama has openly talked about disentangling himself from the Gulf, and of course part of that has involved a Saudi Emirati-led war in Yemen, partly in order to fill what they saw as a US vacuum as well. Also an intensified effort in Syria to provide arms to rebels. And I wonder how the US almost balances that, you know, or even future administrations. Will they like what they see if you have a more assertive Japan, a more assertive Korea, a more assertive Taiwan, who feel less encumbered by US commitments?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Japan's a particularly interesting one. And my sense of it was that there was a bit of sort of back and forth in Washington over how much you should encourage the Japanese nationalism of Abe, or how worried you should be about it. And that quote you mentioned was somebody who was at the meeting said to me that was sort of Kerry's first meeting on Japan. But all the Japan specialists thought that was sort of crazy, and that they talked him round and out of it.
Yes.
But it did express a real dilemma, which is that, of course, particularly when the whole Senkaku Daiayu thing was live, did America say that the Japan Security Treaty covered the islands? Because if you don't say it covers the islands, it sounds like an open invitation to the Chinese to go in there. And if you do say it covers the island, it might provoke the Japanese into saying, great, you know, we can take China on and America's got our back.
Yeah.
And that was the dilemma that Kerry was referring to.
And did they strike the right balance?
Well, I don't know, time will tell, but I think that in the end, the pro-Japan wing won the argument in Washington. So Kerry came in and said, look, you know, don't like the look of some of this Japanese nationalism, which when you look at it, I mean, obviously Japan is the democratic country and the ally of America and has a much more open culture. I don't deny any of that.
Yeah.
But there is a strong element of Japanese nationalism. Again, in the book, there's this incident I mentioned where wasn't much noticed in the West. I just happened to be in South Korea at the time, where they were appalled because Abe appeared in a fighter plane with the numbers 731 on the side, which was the number of a Japanese torture squad in the Second World War. And of course, they said, "Oh, well, that's
it was a mistake.
Unfortunate coincidence," but nobody believed it. But anyway, so there were question marks about it. But I think that the Americans, over time, thought, look, the real problem is China.
Yep.
We have to fall back on classic deterrence. And so Obama goes to Tokyo and says, actually, the first time an American president has said this explicitly in terms in Tokyo or anywhere, the islands are covered by the US-Japan Security Treaty. And again, somebody quoted in the book, one of his team said to me, we just gave the middle finger to China, you know, in a sort of rather macho Washington way. But they'd had that debate, and then they resolved it by saying, no, you know, we've got to stick with the Japanese.
Yes. So, I mean, about half we've discussed the Asian dynamics so far. We have about 10 minutes left for our discussion before we move on to questions. Half the book actually isn't about Asia. It's about the way in which the rise of Asia, particularly the rise of China, but also the rise of other powers and so on, is affecting things outside of Asia. Yeah. And I was really struck by that. There are fantastic chapters on the Middle East, on Europe, on Russia, on some of the border areas, Turkey, the Caucasus, and how China's rise and these other countries' rise are feeding into those dynamics as well. What I was interested in is, I guess from the European point of view, we have the Prime Minister's trip to India coming up next week, and that's obviously part of the UK's post-Brexit diplomacy, but also can't be separated from our own engagement with China. And you have, I think, a much bigger challenge for Europe, which is doesn't face the same issues. It doesn't have the same degree of security commitments to the Japanese. It doesn't have the same issues around how far to take maritime patrols. The Chinese have been beaming us a very simple message, which is stop worrying about the human rights aspect, stop trying to change us, stop discussing sensitive issues. We will help make you rich.
We'll build you a high-speed railway. Yeah, that tends to be the
we will
pitch,
plough
yeah.
vast and unimaginable amounts of capital into your economies, plug you into one belt, one road, our initiative for regional connectivity. It's very simple. All you have to do is stop meeting the Dalai Lama, stop talking about human rights, and effectively join the club. And countries that have broken away from that message have suffered.
Sure,
the Norwegians have been in deep freeze for the Nobel Prize award to a Chinese dissident. And it's effectively mounted to Chinese economic sanctions on Norway. Of course, we ourselves were in the freezer for a long time. And I wonder if you think we have got that balance right. There's a great quote where George Osborne tells an advisor, the South China Sea will fall under Chinese influence. The clue's in the name.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we have a new leadership, which maybe has been sending signals it's less sure of this tidal wave of Chinese capital.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a strong feeling, certainly to some extent in this city, but definitely in Washington, that Osborne had gone overboard in the wooing of China, and that it was both naive and slightly kind of humiliating. And so everything was set for a slight swing back.
Yeah.
But then Brexit happens. And I think although May did look at the nuclear deal, it's very, very hard when you've got a whole policy which is based on the idea that, well, Britain's going out to the world and Europe's not the only thing in town anymore, and then to say, oh, but we're going to have a more antagonistic relationship with China.
Yes.
At that point, you more or less have to double down on China. I'm not sure that's a good bet in the long run, because I think the American critics of the policy have a point in the sense that they don't think China ultimately signs contracts with you or does business with you over the long run for these kinds of reasons. But I think the British will pursue this very kind of mercantilist approach to China and indeed to India next week.
Well, there's two questions that follow. One is, were we wrong to join the AIIB?
No, I think we weren't. I think even the Americans now think that that they mishandled it rather than the British mishandled it.
Because they were scathing at the time.
They were very angry at
I
the
think
time.
they talked about constant accommodation.
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
their phrase.
Yeah, they did talk about constant accommodation, indeed to the FT. And,
Yes.
and then, but I mean, I saw rather nice. I was at a meeting where there was British and American diplomats discussing this shortly afterwards. And a British diplomat said, yeah, well, I can see constant accommodation is a bad idea, but surely some accommodation is a good idea. And, he packaged it in that way. And I think that the fact that it was terribly badly coordinated by both sides, because it was set up as humiliatingly as possible for America, because Britain led the way, and then everybody piled in, the Australians, the Germans, the French, and it was left with just the Americans having obviously lobbied against this, sort of unable to prevent their closest allies going in. It couldn't have been worse choreographed.
Yes.
But these things, people get very, very upset at the time. And it's hard to know which ones will last. I mean, so that I think the AIIB, people like me and you remember it, it hasn't really sunk in amongst the great public. Whereas something like the Syrian Red Line, which I think is another example of something at the time you don't know how important it's going to be. You think maybe this is just the story of the week. But that has resonated almost more, it's been more of a defining moment for Obama than killing Osama bin Laden, which I think he would have thought was, sending a message out to the world that he'd done this thing. And
established his
everybody's
credentials.
kind of forgotten that. And that failure to follow through on the Red Line is something I write about a lot in the second half of the book, because I think it's helped to define, fairly or unfairly, American, inverted commas, weakness under Obama, and it's had repercussions not just in the Middle East, but in Eastern Europe and in Asia.
So, I mean, on that question, we've talked about a Trump presidency, and it seems to me that American officials can insist as hard as they want that the pivot has teeth, that they're serious, and so on, but it's going to take something really substantial to counteract 8 years of perceptions in the Middle East and in Asia that the US ultimately is a declining power. And do you think a Clinton administration and her potential advisors, people quoted in your book like Kurt Campbell, the former Assistant Secretary of State, I think, are they willing to take more dramatic steps in Asia
I think
to signal their continued presence?
I think the first thing that will be in Clinton's inbox, if it's her, will be actually Syria. And they'll have to make a very hard decision quite soon about. She's talked about a no-fly zone.
Yeah.
Is she really going to do that and risk shooting down Russian planes or getting into a direct conflict with the Russians? And that will send a signal, about how she's going to handle the rest of the world. But I think that over the course of a 4-year presidency, there's no doubt that they will have to assess how hard they're going to push against China on these issues in the South China Sea.
Sure. And in terms of our own engagement, just one last point about the UK. We've had drills with the Japanese Air Force just now. I think the first time the Japanese Air Force has had joint exercise with any power other than the United States.
Yep.
We have the India trip coming up, as I mentioned as well. Are we able to effectively have our cake and eat it too? Can we engage with all of these Asian powers bilaterally, independently, taking what we wish? Or do we also have to be sensitive to the strategic dynamics within Asia? Do we also have to take a stronger stance on issues like freedom of navigation, on issues like maritime disputes?
Don't know. I mean, I thought the Typhoon things this was the joint air exercises with Japan.
Yes,
were interesting because I had assumed until I heard about that basically our strategy was to say we're just going to do the commerce and we're no longer a military power in Asia, and in a way that kind of suits us.
Yes.
And that would be a continuing tension with the United States. Now, if we are doing these joint exercises with Japan, maybe I got that wrong, and actually the British do have in mind the idea that we will become more of a strategic presence in Asia, albeit with limited resources. But I think that, maybe we're at the very soft end of a dilemma that you can see, particularly, say, for the Australians,
Yes.
who face it much, much more acutely, which is they're really trying to ride both horses, which is to have their economy is incredibly dependent on trade with China, and yet they are a part of the West, sort of adrift at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean,
Yes.
and are doubling down on their alliance with the United States. And how do they keep those two things in balance is already an acute dilemma for the Australians and beginning to be a question for the British.
Yes, and I think for the Australians, this is a member of the Five Eyes Alliance. They're an intimate partner of the West. They're a member of the Atlantic Alliance in all but name in that sense.
Yeah.
And their debate has been in flux for many years, which is why they've danced around the issues of patrols in the South China Sea for over a year now. I think they did aerial patrols in the South China Sea, but they had held off from the issue of do we send ships in seriously. And I think it's interesting to see how they've chosen to do it with a middle Asian power like Indonesia rather than the US, which is almost a way of tempering the blow or keeping it softer. I have just actually one very last question before we open it up, which is you have a very, very good chapter on Russia as well, and Russia's own pivot to the east, as you call it. Whenever I've spoken to Indian officials in London or in India, they often complain vociferously. You in Europe have pushed Russia into the arms of China with sanctions, with isolation, and so on. And of course, while that's understandable from our point of view, what we've done at the strategic level is to reverse decades of antagonism and hostility, or contribute to it at least, by squeezing Russia in that direction. I just wonder where you stand on that, whether you think if great power politics is back, whether we ought to have thought more carefully about keeping these big powers apart, or whether that's kind of outdated 19th century geopolitics.
No, I don't think it's outdated 19th century geopolitics. And if Donald Trump is in fact an undiscovered strategic genius, that's part of what he may be thinking, is that if you have a rapprochement with Russia, you can pull them back. There is this sort of triangle, ever since Kissinger days and before, Russia, China, the US, and generally you don't want to be the distant bit of the triangle. You try to sort of
yes.
But I think that it's both the case that we probably have driven Russia into the arms of China, but that we may not have had an option. I don't think you could allow the annexation of Crimea and just say, oh, well, fine, because you're important to us in this sort of bigger strategic game, you can do something like that. I think, however, that the West probably has underestimated the depth of the Russia-China partnership. The way that people tended to dismiss it initially was the Chinese will completely take the Russians to the cleaners. The Russians are deeply suspicious of the Chinese and are worried about Siberia. I mean, those things may be true in the long run, but I think what they missed is that there's an identity of worldview between Moscow and Beijing, which is that they both think that we are out to get them, to put it bluntly, that we want to overthrow their domestic political systems through the use of, nefarious promotion of democracy, NGOs, whatever. I was in China shortly after the first Hong Kong demonstrations, and they viewed it very much as a kind of color revolution of the sort that they felt that the West had sponsored in Ukraine.
Yes.
They bought the Russian line about what had happened in Ukraine, and they thought now they're trying to do it to us. And
they express it slightly more sensitively at the global level in terms of...
Yeah, but domestically they certainly don't. And so I think that element of a sort of ideological coming together around the idea of resisting a Western-led world order which they feel is out to flatten their systems.
And we saw that in the BRICS, the summit of the BRICS summit only a few weeks ago, and the joint declaration at the end, with Brazil and India and South Africa also in tow. But the declaration was one of the most Western skeptic statements we've seen from that organization in many years, driven by Russia and China. And particularly interesting was the line in there about the BRICS reject any continued efforts to misrepresent the outcome of World War II. And a strong sense of historical grievance, I think, that animates them both as well, and that even the other countries were willing to sign up to in that. Thank you very much for that discussion. Let's open it up, and if anyone has any questions, please, if I could first of all clarify that section was on the record. The discussion that now follows will be off the record and not for attribution, so you can ask questions as vicious as you wish. And please do identify yourself by name, and if you wish, your affiliation as well. So